Ever since I read in Staff and Snyder about complex analysis, a question that came up to me, and at the time I ordered this book, was what happens with complex variables when you go to multiple dimensions? It's not like r to the n. We're taught r and then r to the n, and r to the n is grad diff curl, and all that vector analysis for which there's all this physics. And there's just tons of applications, and all the theorems can be proven. And the Stokes theorem takes you all the way to r to the n. What happened? What happened with complex variables? Why can't complex variables be normal? I have no idea, but I have entertained a small addiction to several complex variables that can only be satisfied in the long-term future if I'm able to read on the subject and learn something about the subject. So the first book that I got was this book by Henry Cartan, and it's, as some Dover books, I think this one unfortunately is one of the more typical Dover books where the terminology is a little antique and it's not approachable. So I believe, now the book is not really a several complex variables book. It just happens to have some several complex variables examples. I think by the time I get around to several complex variables, if I ever do, and I hope you, my viewer, does, or do, I hope you do, I'm sorry, not does, you do. Hopefully if you're younger than me, I'm going to be 57 in a little bit, so I'm getting up there. So yeah, so the Cartan book has some basics, it's got examples, but I think it's got old terminology, so there you have it. Then I got me this book, which is really my first GTM, my first graduate text in mathematics that I buy. I'm not going to start collecting these yet in force, as they say in French, because I've got so much undergraduate material to cover that it's kind of pointless, except for just to have something on a shelf. But either way, I got this great book from Michael Range. I looked up what were the books in several complex variables that required the fewest number of prerequisites. That's basically what I went for. And this one came up, and so I bought it, and yeah, I like reading from it in the way that maybe a lower primate, I don't know, maybe a donkey would read several complex variables, something like that, because I don't know anything about it. But either way, I'm mystified by the fact that there's no c to the n. There's no like, oh yeah, there's like complex vector calculus. Go and read about grad diff curl and 5-dimensional complex variables. There's nothing like that, apparently. And so there are some major aspects to the theory, and some terms pop up. Now, in your case, maybe I'm assuming many of the people who watch my videos know a lot more math than I ever will. That's, I think, a safe assumption. If you're one of those people and you can actually read these books, I think this is an interesting topic. Either way. So, Range says that the prereqs for this particular book are calculus, real calculus, Taylor's theorem, implicit IFT and implicit function theorem, substitution formula for integrals, calculus of differential forms, which is chapter 10 in Baby Rudin, then basic complex analysis, Saff and Snyder, Lebesgue measure and R to the n, yeah, and then Hilbert and Banach spaces, which is functional analysis. And then some point set topology, don't read Conway, read something else, read Munkers, and algebra, which I still have to get to. So this is really something a book that I could read after many other books read. Either way, there is something called, it's very interesting because they talk about, all these books talk about the Cauchy-Riemann equations, but in multiple dimensions. I find that interesting. Then also there's something called the Stein manifolds, which are complex manifolds. I'll be very curious to learn about that someday. Then there's something called the Bergman kernel. That's yet another major term in several complex variables. I'm always kind of curious about what the terms are for a field. So I think this field is interesting. And yeah. This book makes mention of a paper by Pfefferman right here. So I was able to dig up this paper by Pfefferman, the Bergman kernel and bi-holomorphic mappings of pseudo-convex domains. Couldn't understand anything in it, but that's a major paper. If you ever get around to be able to read it, there you go. And then also, Range mentioned this book by Narasimhan, which is supposed to be basic. Now, unfortunately, it's printed. It's old style, so it's just somebody it's a typewriter printout from, like, I don't know, the 80s. And then in the case of this book, his prerequisites are Safin Snyder, something like that, measure theory, so basic measure theory, so some early functional analysis, Poinsett topology, implicit function and rank theorems, and in the last chapter, uniqueness theorems in ODEs. And so, yeah, there you have it. So I did get this book. Of course, Papa Rudin has some material that is necessary for these books. I'm not there yet. Range published this article, Complex Analysis, A Brief Tour into Higher Dimensions, and I recommend it. I've read parts of it, not the whole thing, and it is written in a way to bring in people into the field. And then, of course, Rudin wrote a book about the subject. He limited to the unit ball, although really technically it's the polydisc. And I'll mention that page. So yeah, in the case of Rudin, for his prerequisites, he says advanced calculus, basic facts about holomorphic functions, Safin Snyder, Lebesgue theory of measure and integration, and a little functional analysis. So not as many prereqs. And then also, he mentions really that he concentrates on the what he calls the what is. Not, he doesn't call it that. It happens to be the polydisc, and it gets defined here, polydiscs. So, and then also in the case of Rudin, when he goes into what's called the delta problem, he does mention that all you really need is baby Rudin to read this. So there you have it. This book, I've paid $54 for it. Now, it doesn't have any examples and it doesn't have any problems. It's just, oh, actually it does. I'm sorry, I take it back. Sorry, I spoke too soon. It does have examples. It does not have any problems. It has a little bit of a bibliography, actually a big bibliography in the back. So yeah, these books have really great bibliographies. And there you have it. Function theory in the unit ball of C to the n. Received today in the mail. Let me just go briefly through the table of contents for you in case you're interested in this field. Bergman integral. Cartan did some work early on. Yeah. Topics that would require a little bit of functional analysis. LP functions. Yeah. I'll just show it briefly. I mean, I'm not going to read it because, I'm like a donkey reading this thing. So if you're interested, you can pause it and read the table of contents.